Welcome back to week 2 with Dr. Creach as we take a look at the book of Judges and maybe even a little bit about the book of Ruth. Hopefully, this discussion will continue to be edifying and helpful for you, and we are excited to kick this off. So as we came out of the book of Joshua, we saw what the Israelites were dealing with, and now we're going to just jump right into the book of Judges. So let's take a look at what we have to talk about this week. Yeah, so I mean that's a, you know, when you put it all together, it really does tell a story and gives us some hope and gives us a place to go. And as we finish up our discussion on Joshua, before we jump into Judges, you had mentioned even that it seems like the Israelites don't necessarily get it because they still are struggling with it. And that's been the pattern since Genesis. You know, they're blessed, they screw it up, they have repercussions for screwing it up, they cry out to God, God redeems, they celebrate, and then they repeat the process again. And that's what's going on in Joshua. And now we turn to Judges. Mm-hmm. And if there's ever a book where that pattern is repetitive, it is in the book of Judges, and it almost rises and falls on each individual judge. And Judges is maybe even more violent than Joshua when you start looking at some of the things that are being discussed in Judges. So give us a little bit, if you could, of insight of the Judges period, because that's what, like 300-ish, 400-year period of a lot going on. And again, Israel's following that same pattern that they keep following. So what do we need to know here?
Historically, we don't know a lot, you know, right. But here's the time when the Israelites are in the land, but before they have a king. That's the big thing. So they are a tribal society, and that's the picture we get. They're in this liminal period between being nomadic tribes and being an established a nation, a unified political entity, which will eventually be ruled by a king. And so in that, we see some interesting things. We see, for example, a time when it seems there is a greater sense of equality, if we want to call it that, in that we don't have the hierarchies of monarchy, a developed priesthood, all those things yet. And so we see women like Deborah being one of the judges and being the leading figure in Israelite society. Those things seem to have been possible in that period particularly. And so some people look at the book I think that's important because people look at the book of Judges, and one of the things they see in the stories is a great deal of violence against women. And there's some horrendous stories in Judges that fit that category. But it's a real mixed bag. We have at the beginning of the book, especially, these roles for women that people who just kind of give the blanket characterization of this as a patriarchal society, this doesn't seem to fit. Deborah's one example. Aksa, the daughter of Caleb, early in the story, is another example. These are women who have influence and who have a high status. And one of the things that some scholars have seen in the book from beginning to end is a downward spiral from that at the beginning to the horrible acts against women at the very end, and seen in that a kind of measuring stick for how Israel has lost its way. And I think that's probably a good way to read it. So you may have another question about that, but the period itself, that's sort of the picture of it. The rulers during this time are, as you said, they're these charismatic figures who rise up. God raises them up, and they lead for a time, and some of them restore Israel to some sense of autonomy, and then the pattern repeats.
Well, not only does it repeat, it almost seems like it gets worse. It seems like while the judge is alive, they're doing okay, and then when the judge dies, they not only do they regress back to where they started, they regress even further. It seems like sometimes.
Yes, there is. It's not just a cycle. It is a downward spiral. That's right. You see at the beginning the first judge who seems to be sort of ideal, and things happen as they should happen. The Israelites come back to God. They prosper. But as things go on, it doesn't take long before these judges begin to fail. And one of the ones that begins to lead them downward is our good friend Samson. The subject of so many great stories there, and then they become stories for, ironically, we tell to children and read Bible stories to children about Samson. Samson is this guy who at first seems to have everything going for him. His mother dedicates him as a Nazirite, special vow that he will not cut his hair and he will not drink wine. He'll abstain from that. And these are signs of his devotion. These are things that people took as a vow for a time. But his mother declares he'll be a Nazirite forever. Boy, he's got a lot to live up to. Sure. But he's got this start, and then as soon as you meet him, he begins to fail in every way possible to live up to those vows. And he just is controlled by his worst impulses. So he has all this ability to lead the Israelites and to do what's right, but at times he is controlled by his lust, and that's how his story ends with Delilah cutting his hair, and leading it to his capture by the Philistines. At other times, he seems controlled by his desire for revenge, and his own anger gets the best of him. So he really represents, in a way, the downward trajectory of Israel during this period of time, as his life spirals downward.
And as his life spiraling downward, it's almost not almost. It is that he's trying to do things on his own. He's no longer seeking God.
At key points, he's clearly not. Yeah. I also want to just make a comment about Judges in general too. You said early on it has more violence than Joshua. That's right. It does, and just about every variety of violence is there. Some have read this as to say, "Oh, what a horrible book! How could we possibly read Judges as part of our Bible?" I think that one of the problems that leads some to see it that way is that they read the stories of about violence in Judges and assume that somehow all this is being approved by God. And I think that's not at all the case. But the disapproval of God that we meet here is often very subtle. And so you have to look very carefully. And I do think you see patterns in the book that show that the book is presenting negative examples all along the way that get worse and worse as the book goes on. And it's sort of summed up by that repeated refrain toward the end of the last few chapters of the book. Mm-hmm. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's the problem. You said Samson seems to go it alone. The Israelites are not looking to God for direction. They're doing what they think each one thinks is best. And some have read in that statement an anticipation of the monarchy, as though the monarchy is gonna come and establish order. But when you read further, in the narrative past Judges, that never materializes. And so others have wondered if there's not here an ironic statement. There's no human king, no, but the Israelites do have a king. It's Yahweh, it's their God. Just as Yahweh says to Samuel when they do appoint a king, and Samuel is worried that, hey, they're rejecting me from the last of the judges. God says, no, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king by wanting a human ruler. So I think that theory makes a lot of sense, that little refrain is saying to us that there is a king in Israel. They're just not acknowledging it. And so therefore, they're each person doing what he or she thinks is best. And by not looking to God, then this is what leads to this mess they're in.
Yeah, and that whole thing, it seems like in Judges, their temptation to do what the Canaanites are doing is even ramped up more than it was when they first got into the Promised Land. And you had mentioned that they almost look like they're looking for that human king to fix it all. Well, that's coming straight from that temptation of the Canaanites. They've turned away from God at this point, and they're looking to try to fix it all themselves. And that last statement, that last line of Judges where they said everybody saw as they did, or is doing what they saw fit. I wonder how much that resonates in the society we live in today.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's right. I mean, Judges starts where Joshua left off, and it's a lot like Joshua 13, which says there's much of the land still to be possessed. Judges starts that way. Much of the land still to be possessed. And then so people go out to claim their inheritance, to conquer those parts of the land not yet conquered. And the idea is, they are going to establish God's will in the land, but they're never able to do it.
Yeah. And in spite of all that, you brought up a couple of examples back in Joshua. You see God almost welcoming in people that aren't Israelites because of their faithfulness. Brought up Rahab, you brought up then they're looked at as heroes in Jewish lore, and they're carried with such reverence. And then you got this little tiny book of Ruth that's during the Judges period. It's its own book and comes after Judges before Samuel, but it's happening during the Judges period. And Ruth is a Moabite. God doesn't have a positive view of Moabites as we look back through the history of. So what is the takeaway, do you think, from seeing this story of Ruth put into this scripture as far as God redeeming her as a Moabite woman?
I think it's one of those remarkable things about scripture that following these books that see foreigners, well, in a way, see foreigners as in such a negative light. Although, remember, the sojourner, the foreigner in your midst in Deuteronomy, who's to receive special attention and care. They're not to be taken advantage of. But all this anti-foreigner language, don't enter into covenants with them and all that. Ruth comes in almost as a way of saying, now, if you started thinking that all foreigners are somehow bad, no, you can't go there. Here's the example that tells you that's not what's intended. So Scripture has within it correctives to these ideas that we would take too far. And I think Ruth is one of those stories. nobody knows really when Ruth was written. Some take it as a story that comes late in Israel's history that's told to for this very purpose. Israel has been out among the foreign nations, and it would be easy to see all of that as just tainting Israel's history, and the Israelites are having trouble because they have embraced foreigners. A book like Ruth speaks against those ideas and says, no, there are people, this is not an ethnic idea, this is not a racial issue. It's just, there are people who are foreign to you who may be more faithful to Yahweh and to Yahweh's ideals than anybody in the covenant community. So I think that's part of what it's doing. Also, it's kind of like Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. Sometimes we learn our proper behavior by looking at an unlikely example, and we see in them what we should already know and be doing. And that's Ruth. She's this one who acts faithfully, and not just faithfully, but remarkably faithfully with her mother-in-law and with everybody around her. So the story does all that. And then we see how God uses her, that she becomes the ancestor of David and the ancestor of Jesus.
Yeah, and you use the word faithful. A lot of scholars talk about loyalty in the book of Ruth and the loyalty that she shows to Naomi. And even when she says in verses 16 and 17, that beautiful passage, where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I'll stay. And when she talks about your God, she actually refers to, it's the Hebrew God she's referring to there. So clearly she's learned something from Naomi. She's not saying the Moabite God. She's talking about their actual God. So she has a better view almost than some of the Israelites, which is what
she does. Probably, and that's what Boaz recognizes. And the word that comes up in the book that is probably the key to the book is the Hebrew word Hesed, translated steadfast love or faithful loving kindness or something like that. She shows that it's the kind of love that God shows to Israel. We can compare it to the word agape in the New Testament in a way. It's similar in meaning. Ruth shows that to Naomi. Boaz recognizes that in her, and therefore also acts with Hesed, and it spreads, and so produces this increasing goodwill among these people, so that Naomi and Ruth are redeemed. Their lives have a future, and their lives are not cut off. And Boaz too. And then God uses it for these bigger purposes.
And it's almost like God's behind the scenes at work through the whole thing. It's not necessarily as blatantly obvious as it is in some of the stories, but it's clear that God is definitely at work. Just so happens Ruth's in Boaz's field, right?
I was going to say too, I hope as people read Ruth, also recognize it as also just an incredibly masterfully told story that has these larger truths, but the truths come through in part in artistry and through the characters. So God is at work, but boy, isn't Naomi at work? Naomi is quite the schemer, with all of her grief and everything she's dealing with, coming back to Bethlehem and saying, woe is me, call me Mara, the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. But she sees the possibilities. Maybe she sees this incredibly loyal daughter-in-law who breaks all convention in staying with her. This is really kind of a crazy thing to do. If all the men are dead And Ruth has no future in this system. And she insists on returning with Naomi to help preserve her, gives her life up for her. She is, in a way, a Christ figure in this. But then Naomi sees the possibility, go to the field of Boaz, And, and actually it's Ruth who comes back and tells her where she's been. And then Naomi says, go back there again.
Yeah.
And then starts giving her instruction.
Take a bath first, though. Get yourself looking good.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Gives her instructions that eventually sort of gets Boaz to propose, although Ruth really proposes before he has a chance. Great story.
Yeah, it's just like she's the first matchmaker we read about in the Bible. As she puts them together. Well, Dr. Creach, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through the books of Joshua and Judges and a little bit about Ruth. And if you could, would you just maybe leave us with something that we could look at as a congregation as we continue to navigate the stories of the Old Testament, working our way into the New Testament? What would be your advice for our folks as they continue to walk this Bible adventure journey over the course of the rest of this year?
Sure. I want to say a couple things. One, kind of repeating something I said about Ruth, read these stories with a sense of wonder and delight at the stories themselves, because they are incredible stories. They're stories of adventure, of bravery, of sometimes faithfulness, sometimes great unfaithfulness, all that in these stories. And this little part of the Old Testament is particularly rich in that way. Second, there are things here culturally that are going to be foreign to us. Child sacrifice you encounter in Judges, these are things that are not part of our world, and we have to struggle with understanding how they were part of the biblical world. So be patient and seek the resources that you're offering, to understand those things. But finally, and most importantly, see in these stories messages about God at work, about sometimes symbolic messages about how to be faithful to God, sometimes negative examples of what not to do. But all of them are preserved to help us deepen our faith and to grow closer to God, and eventually to lead us to see God's ultimate sacrifice for us in Jesus Christ. So as you're reading, keep that always in mind, that these stories are telling us something about how we should love God, how we should love each other as ourselves. And we just sometimes have to wrestle with how stories teach us that and convey that message.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And as we come to this end of COVID, I look forward to the opportunity that we have to bring you back to in person to lead a couple of classes here, because it's such a rich connection and you bring so much to help us understand Scripture more fully. So
thank you. Would love to do that. Would love to see all the people in person again. And bless you as you continue this study and reading through the Bible.
All right. Well, have a wonderful Lent, and thank you again. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight for week 2 as we wrap up our Joshua, Judges, and Ruth section of C3. Dr. Creach, as you could tell, is a wealth of knowledge, and I encourage you, once we're back in person and he's here again to teach some classes, that you jump on that opportunity. Hopefully he helped you see how these stories are foundational for who we are and what we are supposed to do. My prayer is that they continue to come to life for you as we continue our way through the Bible adventure. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great week, and we will see you in worship again this weekend, either in person or online. God bless.